trapped 2.5 miles beneath the surface of the Atlantic Ocean. The tourist submarine lost whilst on a mission to view the Titanic, with 5 people tonight confirmed to be on board.
We anticipate that there's somewhere between 70 to the full 96 hours available at this point.
It is clear then that the rescuers are now engaged in a desperate race against time. Also on News at 10. Suddenly very busy, the many Tory figures who were keen to be absolutely anywhere else as the vote on Boris Johnson was passed tonight in the Commons.
It is doubly important for us to show that we are prepared to act when one of our own, however senior, is found wanting.
Mistakes were made, David Cameron, on preparations, or the lack of them, prior to the pandemic. Rohit talks to the former Australian Prime Minister about our joint security pact in Asia and what it might mean for the UK. And not shrinkflation, but drinkflation. Why they are watering down our drinks.
This is ITV News at 10 with Tom Bradby.
Good evening. It is, frankly, a horrific concept, trapped in a tiny submarine far beneath the ocean surface, with time and oxygen running out. For almost as long as it has lain on the ocean floor, the Titanic has aroused intrigue and fascination the world over. Resting as it does 3,500 meters below the surface of the Atlantic, the depths of its remains still conceals many of its secrets. And so it was in pursuit of exploring the sunken wreckage that a small submarine set off yesterday morning. But last night, around 400 miles off the Canadian coast, it went missing, with 5 people aboard, including a British man. Tonight, a desperate search and rescue operation is underway.
It is a tiny vessel lost in a vast, vast ocean, hundreds of miles from land. The submersible was on a mission to view the wreck of the Titanic in these deep, cold waters. The desperate mission now is to find it.
Yesterday afternoon, we were notified by the operator of the submersible vessel that it was overdue, and it had 5 persons on board. We understand from the operator of the vessel that the vessel was designed with a 96-hour sustainment capability if there was an emergency on board. And so we're using that time, making the best use of every moment of that time to locate the vessel.
The crew set off from St. John's in Newfoundland, Canada on Friday towards the Titanic. That's a distance of roughly 370 miles. The wreck lies 12,500 feet down, and a full dive to it takes 8 hours. It is 32 hours now since the submersive left the surface.
This is the second year we've been out to the Titanic.
This is the sub designed to reach the sea floor and travel the depths of the Atlantic Ocean.
We have our control screen here.
On this trip, it was carrying 5 people.
I've always liked extremes of possibility.
Among them was the British billionaire Hamish Harding. This is him before a previous adventure, an exploration of the Mariana Trench.
It's the challenge of going somewhere that practically nobody else has gone to.
And this is him yesterday, the last photographs posted on his company's social media account before the expedition vessel disappeared.
We really are focusing on the science around it. We want to document what the wreck is like now and also try to predict what it'll be like in the future.
Ocean Gate is the company that runs these voyages at a cost of £200,000 a seat. There is now a frantic search for their vessel and its crew in a race against the clock. But the submersible, on a trip to see the most infamous of all maritime disasters, should have been seen or heard from by now. And as more time elapses, so too does hope.
And Lucy is here to talk about all this. Lucy, this is a horrific story, a horrific concept, really. What's the latest tonight?
Well, Tom, as you imagine, this search is frantic and it is extensive. In the last 30 minutes, we've heard from the Coast Guards in the States, and they've said that they are using sonar equipment that can look as far down as 13,000 feet. The company, Ocean Gate, have told us that they are exploring and mobilising all options to bring the crew back safely. Their entire focus is on the crew members and their families. It is, of course, not clear yet why this vessel lost contact with the surface. There's speculation it may have got tangled in the wreckage of the Titanic. There may have been a catastrophic failure on board. Nothing is sure just yet. But what we do know for a fact that on board there is a supply of oxygen that can last from between 70 to 96 hours. We are not quite at that limit yet, but we are dangerously close.
OK, Lucy, thank you very much indeed. Now here, it may not totally surprise you to hear that a great many senior members of the government, including the Prime Minister himself, suddenly found themselves incredibly busy today and unable to turn up to vote on the report, which would have sanctioned Boris Johnson had he not resigned. Penny Mordaunt was there and voiced her support, as did Theresa May, as the report was voted through, and by an overwhelming majority too.
59 today, the occupant of this limo, ex-Prime Minister Boris Johnson. His birthday present, the House of Commons has tonight branded him a reckless and intentional liar. Funnily enough, the new Prime Minister wasn't rushing to join MPs rebuking Johnson.
Obviously, this is a matter for the House, not for the government, and that's why each and individual colleagues will make up their own mind when the time comes.
And in case you've forgotten, these were the lies about parties in Downing Street cited by the MPs Court, the Privileges Committee, that led to Johnson being censored and quitting as an MP.
I have been repeatedly assured that there was no party and that no COVID rules were broken. All guidance was followed completely during number 10. I did not lie to the House.
Leader of the House, Penny Mordaunt. At tea time today, there was a bad start for Johnson in the Commons debate when the Leader of the House said she'd be voting to endorse his punishment.
The committee's report found that Mr Johnson deliberately misled the House and the committee, and in doing so committed a serious contempt.
Then the most senior Tory said,
I will support the committee.
And Boris Johnson's predecessor as Prime Minister had a message for the current Prime Minister and other Tory MPs who are absent and abstaining.
I also say to members of my own party that it is doubly important for us to show that we are prepared to act when one of our own, however senior, is found wanting. I will vote in favour of the report of the Privileges Committee.
The committee's chair explained why such a serious punishment was proposed for Johnson.
We felt it necessary to increase the sanction to 90 days to reflect the seriousness of his breaching the confidence of the committee, impugning the committee, thereby undermining the democratic process of the House, and his complicity in a campaign of abuse, attempting to intimidate the committee, stop us from carrying out our work, and to discredit it.
But one of Johnson's most loyal friends was having none of it.
You don't have to kowtow. But for some reason, the Privileges Committee thinks it's in communist China and that we must kowtow.
But as these tweets showed, most Tories have made themselves scarce, campaigning in Uxbridge, for example, because whatever their private views, they know some of their members still back him, and this last one said he'd rather watch the cricket. If they thought their absence would prevent a vote, here was the answer.
No, no, no!
And the result?
The ayes to the right, 354. The noes to the left, 7.
Which means Boris Johnson becomes the first Prime Minister in British history to be judged by the House of Commons as a serial liar. Robert Peston, News at 10.
The Conservatives may have hoped today's debate would draw a line at last under their Partygate woes, but that was until leaked footage emerged this weekend of a December 2020 party, surely not, at their campaign headquarters. Sean Bailey, who had been at the event before these pictures were taken, today apologised unreservedly. Meanwhile, the Met Police say they are assessing the latest claims that have come to light. Long before the lies, long before the parties, and long before even the lockdowns themselves, there were plans for how the UK would deal with the pandemic. But there were repeated admissions today that these focused almost entirely on pandemic flu, not the kind of respiratory disease that ultimately wrought such havoc and claimed so many lives. The former Prime Minister, David Cameron, told the COVID inquiry that that was a mistake.
Today he was back. For one day only, former Prime Minister David Cameron at the COVID inquiry.
I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Starting with a blunt admission, they planned for the wrong pandemic, stockpiling medicines for flu instead of protective clothing for a coronavirus.
And a lot of things would follow from that. You know, in Jeremy Hunt's evidence, hospitals in Hong Kong had to have 3 months of PPE supplies. I was never asked, can we have funding for 3 months PPE supplies for every hospital? But had I been asked, we would have granted it.
Critics asked if Mr Cameron would have really spent that money during the period of austerity he oversaw, and that was where the questioning turned next.
Do you accept, Mr Cameron, that the health budgets over the time of your government were inadequate?
I mean, if you lose control of your debt and you lose control of your deficit and you lose control of your economy, you end up cutting the health service. That's what happened in Greece.
David Cameron has effectively just argued that his policy of austerity made us better prepared when the pandemic hit. It's a suggestion that has infuriated some of those working in the health service.
Well, David Cameron's denial has angered many nurses today. It was at this very time that the government cut thousands of nursing posts, leaving the NHS unable to weather any storm.
Pat Cullen also claimed the government was distracted in the years before COVID as Brexit dominated inside Parliament and out, all the way up to January 2020 when Boris Johnson celebrated actually leaving the EU. For one key scientist who sat on the Emergency SAGE Committee, we weren't ready and our response was inconsistent.
We never had a clear strategy about how we were going to cope with COVID. Pandemics affect every area of society and therefore every area of government. And so, you know, you could list anything. So were businesses prepared for a lockdown? I don't think so. Were schools prepared to be closed? It didn't appear to me that they were.
Do you think they're going to try and blame the scientists?
Probably.
David Cameron did seem to suggest that experts didn't ask the right questions. Later, the most senior health official was asked about politicians, as previously confidential minutes revealed pandemic warnings in a 2016 departmental board meeting. Concerns were raised about a lack of engagement from Jeremy Hunt, then Health Secretary, now Chancellor. He'll be here on Wednesday. Anushka Astana, News at 10.
And Robert joins me now from Westminster to talk about all this. Robert, you've presumably been searching ministers today, almost anywhere but in the chamber I saw, but the vote did go through. What do you make of it in the round?
Look, it's astonishingly bad for Boris Johnson and for the Tory party. 354 MPs voted today that a man who was only Prime Minister less than a year ago is a serial liar. That's an astonishing thing. It's never happened in British political history. And well over 100 Tory MPs voted that their former leader is a serial liar, including at least one, well, a couple of people quite senior in the government, Steve Baker, senior at Northern Ireland, Tom Tugendhat, who goes to Cabinet, and of course Theresa May, who said in the House of Commons, you saw it in my piece, she made this impassioned plea to her Tory colleagues. She said this matters, you know, for the defence of democracy, that when we see somebody, no matter how senior, do something wrong, we call them out. So this is a very, very bad result for Rishi Sunak, who didn't vote, who abstained. And actually, I think most people would say that, you know, when he said to his MPs it's a free vote and you can do what you like, I think he was sort of hoping, actually, in the end, he could avoid, you know, such a dramatic, end to this historic investigation with, as I say, on the record now, well over half of all MPs voting that, you know, Boris Johnson has, you know, committed the greatest transgressions of parliamentary rules of any leader in modern times. There are other reasons why Rishi Sunak will slightly regret what happened today. We had David Cameron, who was Tory Prime Minister only a few years ago. We've had a few of them recently, reminding the world, or being reminded the world of the damage that was being done to public services, particularly the health service, by austerity. And we've got days more of this. We've got George Osborne tomorrow. So my broad assumption is Rishi Sunak wants to get to the summer holidays as quickly as possible.
OK, Robert, thank you very much. Now, let's move on to China, where 2 days of talks with the US Secretary of State have ended with both sides content that progress of some sort at least has been made. That much was evident when the Chinese President, Xi Jinping, shook the hand of Antony Blinken, the most senior American official to visit Beijing for 5 years. But there were few smiles, perhaps inevitably, and tonight Taiwan remains a subject of very significant tension between both countries. Debbie is in Beijing tonight. Debbie, this was a last-minute meeting. What's your reading of the outcome?
Well, Tom, the bar was so low that the US side has left with nothing concrete, but claiming to have achieved everything they expected. Antony Blinken was originally due to visit Beijing in February, but that visit was abruptly called off when, you might remember, an alleged Chinese spy balloon was shot down over the US. That incident plummeted relations to their lowest point. And such was the controlled nature of this visit that it wasn't until an hour before it actually happened that was confirmed the US delegation would be meeting with President Xi Jinping. In the end, it was just a 35-minute meet and greet, but enough for both sides to say that progress had been made in stabilising relations. However, the US has left without an agreement on one major issue. The Chinese government has refused to reopen military-to-military communication, and that is very worrying in a region where there is heightened military activity.
The United States has a long history of successfully managing complicated, consequential relationships through diplomacy. It's the responsibility of both countries to find a path forward, and it's in both our interests and the interests of the world that we do so.
Well, President Xi has said whether these two nations get along bears on the future of humanity. Not a statement to be read lightly when there is a willingness to talk, but still such mistrust between these two nuclear superpowers.
OK, Debbie, thank you very much indeed. Well, on a similar theme, the risk of conflict in Taiwan would, of course, mean the impact being felt far beyond the Pacific. It would seriously test the strength of the AUKUS submarine partnership agreed just 2 years ago. And with two of the signatories no longer on the world stage, the former Prime Minister of Australia has told Rohit the inside story of how it came to be. It is a tale of secrets, half-truths and covert negotiations, and Scott Morrison says caused him more sleepless nights than COVID.
What would war in Taiwan mean for the rest of the world? A sobering assessment tonight from the former leader of one of the countries most concerned.
In terms of the geostrategic economic implications of what would occur in Taiwan versus Ukraine, well, it's a factor of 50. I mean, the economic disruption of such an event, which would inevitably involve great powers, is hard to conceive. It would make, COVID look like a headache.
Scott Morrison did the deal with Britain and America to create nuclear submarines to contain China. AUKUS was drawn up over 18 months. When its three leaders posed for photos at the G7 in Cornwall, they didn't reveal the pact they'd just discussed. A secret they kept from Emmanuel Macron too. AUKUS meant Australia would cancel a huge contract with France to buy conventionally powered submarines from it. There was a furious response.
And as the family photo sort of broke up and we were walking down to see the presentation, I think of the Red Arrows, I think it is, Emmanuel came up to me and sort of just said, "G'day," asked me how things were, and I said, "Well, we're facing very serious challenges in our part of the world."
You were talking about China?
Of course, yeah.
But he didn't tell him he was close to canning the contract with France.
Did you feel you were effectively lying to Macron in that exchange?
No, absolutely not. I knew we were going to be speaking in a week, and that was the right time to have the discussion, not walking down the stairs at a resort in Carver's Bay.
Yeah, he has a different view though, doesn't he?
And a very bad news for the trust. You think he lied to you? I don't think. I know.
The next day, well, there was a fever of activity coming out of the French Defence Department, contacting everyone with an Australian accent they could find.
They were angry?
Well, they were aware that we were looking at this very, very closely.
Was this deception?
No, it was common sense. There's no nice way to tell someone that we're cancelling a $90 billion contract.
Scott Morrison elaborately deceived the French. And he doesn't pretend that he didn't.
But he did say to me in one of those texts, in a text responding, basically saying, look, we're getting good news or bad news on the contract.
So this is what he said in the text?
Yeah. So
no emojis?
No, there wasn't emojis, not that I recall.
Has he texted you lately?
No, I haven't heard from him since.
An author who has unpicked the formation of the alliance and Morrison's role within it says the AUKUS pact could be a deterrent, but could be a provocation.
If you think about the formation of AUKUS, that was formed by three international leaders. Well, two of those leaders are no longer in government, and the one who is in government, President Biden, is hoping to reform relations between Washington and Beijing. So as to how that will change things, it's anyone's guess.
Thank you, Boris.
Clearly, the diplomacy that led to this moment was delicate and difficult. But even since then, their assessment of the threat from China and of the potential for a solution has changed, and it's changing still. Rohit Katru, News at 10.
Still to come on News at 10. 9 men appear in a Greek court charged with people smuggling after an overloaded boat capsized in the Med. And how new rules could mean weaker beers in pubs, but not lower prices. We're back after this very short break. Welcome back. There is, of course, no justice in the simply inescapable horror of last week's migrant tragedy in the Mediterranean. Of the perhaps 750 people on board at the time, barely 100 have been found alive. That figure does, though, include 9 Egyptian men who now stand accused of themselves being the migrant smugglers. They arrived this morning at a court in southern Greece ahead of their first hearing tomorrow, whilst thousands of miles away, the victims' relatives still anxiously await news.
They were missed by most cameras here today, but these ITV News pictures show the suspected traffickers who the Greek police believe are responsible for the deaths of the 500 migrants who drowned in this country's worst maritime disaster of the modern era. The 9 Egyptians who all survived the sinking were taken from the police station handcuffed in threes for the short journey to the local court, where they appeared for the first time as the wheels of justice went into motion here. The 9 Egyptians face a litany of charges, including negligent homicide, causing a shipwreck and belonging to a criminal organization. The proceedings here today involve them being formally interviewed by the prosecuting judge who's building a case against them. Their lawyers have indicated they will deny the charges on the basis they were just migrants themselves rather than people smugglers. That the 9 were all men was a reminder that no women or children were found among the dead or the rescued. When the trawler was abandoned, it was every man for himself. Women and children weren't even last, let alone first. They were not at all. In Pakistan, the Prime Minister declared today a day of mourning for the dozens of citizens presumed dead in the sinking. At least 25 came from this village in Azad, Jammu, Kashmir. Rabina Bibi fears her son Shamrez has been lost, leaving his children without a father. She welcomes the crackdown on traffickers just announced by the Pakistani government. She said she wanted to caution parents the world over not to send their children abroad using people smugglers. In doing so, she had lost money and a son. Here, Greek officials, aid workers and relatives of the dead have been honouring the victims with flowers. And as questions continue to be asked whether or not more could have been done to prevent this tragedy, the Hellenic Coast Guard has again defended its conduct, saying it acted according to maritime law. John Irvine, News at 10, Kalamata, southern Greece.
A terrible death toll after the brutal and horrifying violence at a school in Uganda on Friday has now been revealed, with 38 students among the dead. A total of 42 people were killed, including a school guard and 3 civilians. Their funerals have already begun taking place. It is the latest attack to be blamed on the Allied Democratic Forces, which is said to have ties with Islamic State. Let's move on to a little bit of sport. And while Wales and Northern Ireland continue to struggle in their hopes to qualify for Euro 2024, they both lost tonight. England aren't having such trouble. They made it 4 wins from 4 with a 7-0 thrashing of North Macedonia at Old Trafford. Bukayo Saka scored his first career hat-trick, which included this stunning effort, helping Gareth Southgate's side to a dominant win. They remain top of Group C on 12 points. Finally, if that was a score worthy of raising a glass to, revellers could be forgiven for finding the pleasure a little less than it once was. It turns out the alcohol content of dozens of popular beers has been slightly reduced. Perhaps predictably, it spawned yet another catchphrase, this time not shrinkflation, but drinkflation. And whatever the claims that the change could be, at least in part, on health grounds, it has all left some punters feeling distinctly bitter.
There are worse jobs than brewing beer for a living, but making it pay is harder than ever, because even the humble pint isn't immune from inflation.
From like the rent of the kegs that we use, from like the cans, from like the labels, everything literally went up for like a 30%.
This independent brewery has passed on some costs to customers and soaked up the rest. But bigger names are doing something else. Heineken, which makes Foster's beer, has dropped its alcohol content in this can by 0.3%. This bottle of Green King's Old Speckled Hen now contains 0.2% less, and the alcohol content of this serving of Bishop's Finger is down by the same percentage. The reductions are small but mean a tax saving of 2 to 3 pence per bottle or can, which isn't being passed to customers.
Heineken insists there's nothing stealth-like about this change, telling us that they emailed or wrote letters to customers like supermarkets and pubs back in November. They also add that customers are increasingly choosing lower alcohol products anyway, a point that Shepherd Neame, the makers of Bishop's Finger, also make.
But industry analysts aren't entirely convinced.
I think we should be a bit sceptical of brewers' claims that this is being driven by anything other than the financial incentives. There may be some social responsibility or some ethical impulse there, but I think the most likely explanation here is that this is being driven by the tax incentives.
It certainly isn't going down well with drinkers.
Well, I think it's diabolical. It's another hidden charge that they're trying to bring out so the customer's paying while the brewery are making more money.
Most companies probably do this in some shape or form, like you said, whether it's alcohol or whether it's food or whatever it is. I think that everyone's doing it.
Everyone gets fat on it, don't they, apart from us.
I hope I haven't ruined your pint.
Well, it tastes a bit sour now, a little bit more bitter. Yeah.
If you're tempted to seek solace in a pint or two, at least your hangover should be fractionally less than it might have been. Rachel Younger, News at 10.
Just before we go, a belated but thoroughly deserved honour for Manchester United's youngest ever first-team player. David Gaskell was barely 16 years old when he made his debut for Sir Matt Busby's Babes in 1956. Until today, though, he hadn't received his medals for being part of a league-winning squad. But thanks to a retrospective change in the eligibility rules, Gaskell was finally rewarded for his efforts all those years ago. A little unfair to have waited that long, but I guess better late than never. That's all we have time for. I'll see you tomorrow. Good night. Thanks for watching.